Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today to this seminar, Iraq between political impasse and regional competition. This event is part of a series of initiatives promoted by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the International Cooperation and the Italian Institute for International Political Studies in the framework of the eighth edition of the Rome Med Dialogues, which will take place in Rome from 1 to 3 December 2022. Too often the world tends to forget how important Iraq is, only to be awakened when events originating within its boundaries trespass them, directly affecting our own societies in ways and modalities often impossible to predict. Today, we will try to shed light on what is happening in Iraq after an 8 months long deadlock that followed the early election held last year, and especially after Muqtada al-Sadr urged the members of parliament from his bloc to resign. A decision with important political implication, since al-Sadr could count on the support of over 70 lawmakers, and since he has been widely considered the kingmaker of the Iraqi political arena. Yet, we will not limit our analysis to internal political dynamics only. Iraq's internal equilibriums continue to be deeply affected by the competing agendas of multiple state and non-state actors. We will focus then on how the Iraqi political arena is influenced by the Washington-Tehran competition, as well as by the objectives of other key regional powers. Our panelists will help us understanding these complex dynamics. Glover Al-Aldin is the founding president of the Middle East Research Institute. He is former Minister of Higher Education and Scientific Research in Kurdistan Regional Government and Professor of Medicine in Nottingham University. Maria Fantapi is Special Advisor for the Middle East and North Africa region at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. Before joining HD, she served as Senior Advisor for the International Crisis Group, and she was seconded by the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs to the EU mission in Iraq. Lahi Beagle is the International Crisis Group Senior Analyst for Iraq. She has previously worked as security advisor for the NGO Safety Organization, and she has been involved in mediation in Iraq, Libya, and Syria for the Dialogue Advisory Group. She has conducted extensive research on Iraq since 2013, and she has collaborated with a wide range of organizations and institutions. Before giving the floor to our experts, I would like to remind you that if you have any questions, you can submit them via the Q&A section. We will ask our panelists to reply to them at the end of the event. So let's start with the first round of questions that will be mainly dedicated to the internal Iraqi political situation. And let's start with Maria. Maria Fantapi, welcome once again, and thank you very much for joining us. And I will kindly ask you to indicate how the resignation of Muqtada al-Sadr MPs could alter the current equilibriums of the Iraqi political system, and what motivation led al-Sadr to take such a decision. Thank you very much, Maria. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Frisbee, for this kind invitation. It's always a pleasure to be part of your initiatives. You start by asking an impossible question, because we actually analytically never know how to explain the decision-making behind Said Muqtada al-Sadr. Therefore, I will try to actually take a more analytical approach and try to understand really how we came to the situation of a potential tripartite alliances between Muqtada al-Sadr, one of the Kurdish parties, and al-Halbusi, the Sunni Speaker of Parliament, and why now we actually moved to a second situation where this is probably not going to be no longer the framework within which the new government is going to be formed. And I think that I will build on what you mentioned, the fact that Iraq political system, it's a sort of a mix and the result and the outcome of an interaction between domestic factors and external factors. So how did we ended up with a very new scenario where actually there was, because during the past 20 years, we saw that usually the government formation in Iraq was proceeding through a consensual process within each one of the three main community. So there was therefore an agreement between the main Shia political parties, among the main Kurdish political parties among the Sunni, and then there was alliances formed after that. And especially the principles of a consensus within the Shia community, the Shia house was never broken, even when then they split between different sides, but still it was by consensus that was done. So I think that this scenario that we arrived to in October, after the election of October of last year, it's a new scenario whereby there was actually a tripartite alliances between three different components of each one of the community, and I think that was a result again of both a domestic political situation that had changed, the fact that there had been the Tishrini movement, which had really changed the political debate within Iraq, and pushed actually Muqtada al-Sadr himself to take the lead to a certain extent of this reformist agenda, and therefore give him a sort of a distant position from that one of the other Shia political parties. But also I think that this tripartite alliances was the result of a changed regional scene, where actually there was no longer the situation where you had on the one hand Iran sponsoring the Shia house, and on the other hand finding a compromise with the other main actor in Iraq, which is the United States. The regional situation had changed dramatically, on the contrary, with the much more complicated setting of issues, where the United States had been more on the backyard of issues, more disengaged, and more regional actors had been actually proactively playing a role within Iraq. And most importantly, what has been a game changer has been the fact that beyond Iran, which is a traditional player within the Iraqi scene, we had seen Gulf countries, and in particular Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, as well as Turkey, playing an important role in engaging the Shia community, and especially members of the Sadrist bloc. Therefore, I think that this shift, also this regional shift, gave way to the fact that Muqtada could feel, and its movement could feel, both more domestically emboldened because it had sort of umbrella of the reformist agenda under which to work on, but also regionally supported to actually move ahead and try to really build an alliances with political blocs from political actors that are Kurds and Sunnis, and therefore trying really to take a distant position from other members of the Shia communities, and in an attempt really to become what I call the primus inter pares among the Shias. And therefore that really led him to calculate that was a possible way forward. I think that so this is, I think, how we arrived to the tripartite alliances. How did we move away from it? It also is explained with through an interaction between internal and domestic factors. And I think that internally there has been a weakening linkages of trust, I think, between the Sadrist movement and also the main Kurdish political party, the Kurdistan Democratic Party. But most importantly, I think there has been a strong regional pressure exerted really also by Iran to try to really recompact the Shia community under one umbrella, especially in the view of the fact that Iran increasingly is facing the prospect of an escalation with Israel. And that definitely places the Shia communities, all groups of the Shia communities, to line up behind Iran into this potential future crisis that may come. And the anti-normalization law that was just passed a month ago, was a sign of it. It was proposed by Muqtada al-Sadr, and I think this should open our eyes on how much actually on certain issues that are regional, he could no longer actually side away from the other Shia political group. So I think that this, and I will finish here, the fact that we moved away from the scenario of a tripartite alliance, which could have been a game changer in the 20 years of political patterns that we have seen within Iraq political system, I think it tells us two things. On the one hand, it tells us that there are some spasm within attempts to actually move forward and move beyond this consensus community-based decision-making of forming a government. But also it tells us that still, whenever there is regional pressure, then we return towards the same pattern of actually having a consensus and trying to reach a consensus within each one of the community, and then proceeding with the formation of the government. I don't want to take more of the time, but very happy to elaborate further in the second round of questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. I was listening to your reply, and it was interesting. I was remembering the situation that followed the 2011 elections, when later on al-Maliki then ended with the Erbil agreement, and then and I remember very well that a few months later, the same Muqtada al-Sadr was leading a series of talks with other actors, both in the north and in the center-western part of the country, that were in a certain way reflecting this sort of tripartite alliance we were referring to, albeit the actors were slightly different at that time. But for sure, this consensus-based process is something that has been defined, that has defined the political system in Iraq, at least from 2005 onward. And this was exactly one of the elements against which the Tishrin movements raised up and tried also to defeat. But thank you very much for your observation, and I will come back to you during the second round of talks. Thank you very much. Lahib, now I would kindly ask you to, after with Maria, we started talking about how also the regional scenario influences the internal political dynamics of Iraq. I would like to kindly ask you, how does Muqtada al-Sadr decision could affect the so-called coordination framework and the elements that are closer to Tehran? And also, another important factor we have to take in consideration, since both Muqtada al-Sadr and the key actors of the coordination framework can rely on important military capabilities, both through the PMF and other actors, how could this situation impact at the security level? Because I think that nobody forgot what happened outside of the Green Zone a few years ago during the Haider al-Abadi premiership. So please, Laib, the floor is yours. Thank you very much once again for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Very interesting question, obviously. I think everyone is thinking about what will happen now. So for the Shiite coordination framework, I think many were cheering, especially Sadr's main rival, Nouri al-Maliki. But I think it's more complicated than simply Sadr giving away the scene for his rivals to form a government. Some of them will even be hesitating on forming a government without Sadr being a part of the political process, simply because they know that Sadr has the capability to stir demonstrations, although that might be unlikely in the current environment. He didn't only force his MPs to resign, he also announced that he is withdrawing from the political process, which is not new for him. He's done this in the past, and he's taken his rivals by surprise in the past as well. And I think right before the elections in July or so, he did a similar move where he claimed that he was no longer running for elections. And so for about a month, he threw off his opponents in a way where they were uncertain of whether they should even put up their election campaigns. And then it was clear that it was only a tactical move that he benefited from. And obviously he had already benefited from being the main driver of how the election law and especially the electoral districts were drawn. I do think that most of the parties within the framework will see this as an opportunity to form a government, since the second winning MPs in many of these districts are not Sadrist. So because of the smaller electoral districts, you could potentially have rival candidates of other parties. And there has been some numbers coming out on the weight of that, and so his 73 MPs might be replaced with at least up to 50 that are non-Sadrist. And then there is a question as to what would the second line candidates of the Sadrists do as well. Probably they won't be allowed to enter parliament if he stands by his word. There is still, I mean, there will be actually, I think, a session tomorrow where there's going to be some sort of decision on this. But other than that, we also have a recess for Parliament, which means that there is still room to withdraw this decision, although I don't think that Sadr means to do it. But then the question remains for the framework parties of whether they can compel the KDP and the Sovereignty Alliance, the Sunni Alliance, to change their position. They obviously had high hopes for the tripartite alliance. I don't think that any one of them saw the ruling of the Federal Supreme Court coming that established the 2/3 quorum rule for electing president. I mean, it existed, but the formalities for how it would proceed and whether you could open a session were unclear. And so despite being close to 2/3, they were not able to have this election. And then the question remains whether the framework can manage such a scenario themselves. So yes, they will have additional MPs. And they have definitely some of the so-called independent MPs that are already aligned with them, and the PUK, the main rival Kurdish party to the KDP. But I think for now, from some of the statements that I've seen of both Sunni and KDP representatives, they're very hesitant to go into this sort of alliance with the framework parties. On the KDP side, there's a concern because they have been under attack from some of the pro-Iran resistance group that are part of the framework, and the same goes for the Sunni alliance, where many individual MPs and even the speaker himself has been under great pressure and intimidation and also direct attacks on some occasions. So I think going forward, this equation is more complicated than we might imagine, even though for the framework parties, of course, it is a big victory considering how beaten they were after the election results were announced. I think I'll stop there and we can continue.
Thank you very much, Lahib. Very, very interesting. Once again, we learned how the regional scenario influences internal dynamics and how complex are the relation between the multiple parties that defines de facto the Iraqi political arena. Delaware, thank you very much once again for being here. May I ask you, how does Muqtada al-Sadr decision impact on the Baghdad-Erbil relation that we know are quite problematic, at least, and even more important, I would say, how this could impact on the ongoing KDP-PUK competition, the two main parties of the KRI, the Kurdistan Democratic Party and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. Thank you very much, Delaware. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for hosting us and for this question. Clearly, it is a multi-component question. I might start from the end. Now, you previously asked me whether a new election is on the agenda, a snap election, or are we going to see that being forced by Sadr from the street? I want to give a very clear answer, and that is sticking my neck out and making a prediction. But anybody can go wrong with any prediction for as long as Sadr is in the game. At the moment, another election, an early election in the very short term, in the immediate and short term, is not on the agenda. It's not going to happen. And essentially, Sadr has already implied that in his statements, in his behavior, in the inside information one can get. So that is probably not going to happen, but we are not ruling out intermediate term and long term, where, by the way, Sadr never started any protests in the past, but he was riding on them. He was taking full advantage of them. He's got the organizational capacity, the financial capability. He provides the infrastructure for it to sustain itself and be effective. So he might contemplate that in the intermediate term, but this will be long after a new government is already formed. So he may or may not trigger it, but let's wait and see in the intermediate term. In terms of forming a government, whether the coalition or say the coordination framework, we call it CF for abbreviation, CF led by Maliki and the PMF and all the non-Sadrists effectively. They all got together, they remained united, they defeated Sadr's project, and they didn't expect Sadr to quit. They are a diverse group, opinion is divided between them, but they all agree that the only way that this deadlock would be opened and eliminated is to form a government. And they will not hesitate. They have enough majority, now they get even greater majority. So a government is actually in the process of formation. And the Sunnis and the Kurds, the majority will join in. That's Iraq, we know them. It's nothing strategic about the alliances they had with Sadr, and there's nothing that strategic about not joining the CF. So it depends on exactly from within the Sunni community who, but I suspect the majority. And within the Kurds, again, I suspect the majority will join. So that means they can not only form a government, but they cross that hurdle of the blocking third at the time of nominating a president or electing a president who will then immediately nominate a candidate to become MP. That session for the presidency requires 220 MPs, and they will get that. They have already, by Sadr's withdrawal, because that would have blocked that through the constitutional is gone. So that means we will see maybe in the next couple of months a new government formed. This is a challenge for the KDP and PUK, back to the core of your question, because their competition, internal competition, made them lose one of the biggest opportunities to actually go to Baghdad with absolute strength, where they could regain their position of being kingmakers. The Kurds had 63 MPs, and there would be no government without them. Had united, they could have had greater conditions, greater power of veto, and they would have probably regained some of their positions of the past. Now, when that didn't happen, it was going to a dead end even internally within Kurdistan, let alone within a dead end within the Shia community. But by Sadr's withdrawal, the KDP and PUK are presented with a fresh opportunity, a golden opportunity to forget the past, compromise between them, and go to Baghdad united. They can get a lot more out of it. Now, I would say this time it's even more important, more critical for them to be united, because the next government will be a very difficult one, for the Kurds especially. The very people who've been pressing Kurdistan region, and especially KDP, who've been liaising with Iran, have been putting pressure on the oil and gas ruling by the federal court, preventing Kurdistan to sell oil independently, on the drone attacks that we've been getting every now and then, on so much more. It's the PMF who are in the lead in the CF government, and they are the ones who are dominant in the disputed territories. And that's where our problems are. So essentially, tensions will remain even when the Kurds join the government. So it's tradition now where this love-hate relationship continues, where everybody's in the government, yet the government behaves as though it's actually not one policy. So even now, under Kadhimi, you find that the ministries of finance and minister of oil are actually squeezing Kurdistan for cash and for oil export, even though the prime minister doesn't agree with them, or maybe he does, but he is on friendly terms with Kurdistan, even though we have a number of ministers in his government who are Kurds representing KDP, and we have the president who's a Kurd. So imagine being in a government where you cannot stop certain ministers who belong to a certain group pushing for certain changes and pressing Kurdistan and preventing progress here. So the Kurds, if they go into this next government divided, they will have no power of veto, no way of stopping any anti-KRG policies. Whereas if they go in, they can actually dictate their terms from the outset and then make sure that the next government obliges, otherwise it should not survive. Because any government wanting to be formed, they need both KDP and PUK. They can always do with delaying their participation. They can always do even without them in terms of numbers. But governments of that nature eventually would fail under the burden of having tensions with Erbil, having international problems, and so on. Another angle of the Kurdish unity would be for the international community. The international community, the coalition especially, anti-ISIS and all the West, they have found it critical for them to have loyal, minded parties in Baghdad to keep the Shia government that is CF-led under pressure. So if the Kurds end up being weak and the Sunnis are already weak, the international community will lose major partners in pressing Iraqi government to, say, for example, give way or cooperate on the strategic dialogue with the Americans, on being kind of distancing a little bit from Iran and engaging the Arab world. All of that, you need components within the government and the parliament being strong, united, so strong partnership with the West. So that's about the Kurdish unity being given a second chance, but whether they will take that chance, it's doubtful, or it's possible. They have done it before. They can actually, through one visit, one kind of engagement, get over their problems, so they're capable. But given the way they're at the moment debating between them how to manage this negotiation, they are dragging their feet and they're not really forthcoming. So it could go either way, but public demand and public pressure on their unity is increasing, and themselves realized over the last 8 months they lost too much by not being united. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Dlawar. Thank you for your insights on the dynamics within the KRI, and also I would add today the linkages with external actors within Iraq, I mean, and beyond the borders, let's say, of the KRI. Let's now begin with the second round of questions, and once again, I come back to Maria. And let's talk about now the role regional dynamics play in Iraq, and how Washington, not only regional and international dynamics also plays within Iraq. How Washington looks at the current situation, and another interesting question, I think, is Muqtada al-Sadr still perceived as a bitter enemy like he was at the beginning, immediately after Saddam Hussein was ousted, or is there room for a future cooperation? Please, Maria.
Thank you, Andrea. Well, Washington actually, I mean, this is not a surprise, what I'm going to say, that, I mean, for Washington, the Middle East has been a declining priority, and Iraq has part of the Middle East as well. So definitely US policymakers are really busy with other issues. But I have to say that for Washington, the way that they see, they look at Iraq now through the lens of JCPOA, non-JCPOA scenario. So it's very important to understand that the Biden administration policy vis-a-vis of the Middle East, especially in areas that are neighboring Iran, has been really dominated by the prospect or a non-prospect of a nuclear deal. And unfortunately, now we are more likely to have a no-JCPOA scenario. I was just these days just discussing with people who are involved into this process closely, and unfortunately and I think also as European, but also Washington is also preparing for a no JCPOA scenario, which would mean a scenario where Iran would then be more and more looked as a potential threat, as a threshold state that could potentially reach the bomb, and also a state that therefore does not normalize relations with Washington, and therefore I think that this will more and more lead Washington to look at Iraq through the lens on how is it possible to contain further Iran offensive capacities, and expecting that specifically Iraq will be one of the arena within which the Iranians basically will launch retaliations in case of attack. So I think that Washington really look at ways on how to curtail and contain Iran, especially in the case of a no JCPOA scenario. This is one. Second, I think that it's very important to see that the US disengagement in the Middle East has been followed also by a sort of delegation of the US to Israel in terms of like curtailing Iran. So Israel is very active player now in the region, and it will be even more in case there will be not a JCPOA. There has been a lot of speculation related to actually Israel involvement precisely in the KRI region through operations that were targeting Iran, and this is once again another reason why I say that Iraq really will be most likely an arena within, on the one hand, Israel, in case it has really operational capacity in there, could actually launch operation against Iran, and also an arena in which Iran would retaliate, specifically the Kurdistan region. It could retaliate directly, as we saw also with the February strike, which has been claimed by the IRGC, or it could retaliate also through its local allies, so the Hashd al-Shabi and the Fasail, and this will definitely create increasing tension, especially in the disputed territories where you have paramilitary forces closer to Tehran and Kurdish forces linked to the KDP. So we should definitely expect that. And then I think that beyond the Israel-Iran escalation, how it will play out in Iraq, I think that there is another element related to Washington containment strategy vis-a-vis of Iran in case of no JCPOA, which is the fact of also in some way letting and encouraging other players, regional actors that are competing with Iran, or they have competing interests with Iran, to actually make a gain within Iraq. So we can expect, I think, Turkey to a lot of tolerance, I think, from Washington in having more Turkish operation in north of Iraq, and also strong support for Gulf countries, and specifically the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, to continue their economic and political investment within the Iraqi political arena. So all this, I think, will have an impact because on Iraq domestic situation, because it could dangerously lead to a scenario which is not exactly the scenario that we saw years ago, when there was a almost direct confrontation between the United States and Iran, and Iraq was the arena of it. But we could have this, and therefore, definitely US assets such as coalition military bases or Ain al-Assad in Anbar will be definitely potential targets of strikes, either launched directly by the Iranians or by militias affiliated to it. But also we can have another more complicated scenario where Iraq will be really this arena of Israel-Iran competition, or like an arena of mutual retaliation to a certain extent. And I think that in both cases, this is why the Prime Minister of Iraq, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, said that the absence of a JCPOA will strongly affect Iraq, and I totally agree, because definitely it will reinforce and accelerate this escalatory dynamic, and make once again, unfortunately, Iraq as the battleground of these different interests. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much also for mentioning the presence of US forces at the Ain al-Asd base, that is de facto placed in the very center of the Upper Jazeera. And in that sense, we have to consider this scenario you were mentioning in the light also of what is happening in northeastern Syria. So the two areas are particularly important when we consider the Tehran-Washington competition in the area and the tentatives by Washington to counter the Iranian presence and what Fabrice Balanche referred to the Iranian land bridge in the Levant a few years ago. Thank you very much, Maria. Lahib, let's now talk about how Tehran is looking at the ongoing impasse in government formation, and especially how intra-Shia rivalries affect the Islamic Republic and its interests and the strategic posture in Iraq. Please, Lahib.
Thank you. So I think I will start from the latter and connect to the point that Maria mentioned in her first intervention, which is that when the regional sort of tensions come to a head, especially when it comes to Iran, the Shia groups tend to align. It's not necessarily because they do so out of a strong conviction about the resistance movement in general. Not all paramilitary groups in Iraq adhere to that, but many of the strong ones do. And so even Sadr, which is an opponent of them, would want to kind of own these issues before his rivals get to them. So the anti-normalization law was a good example of that. But he's also an actor that wants to clearly show that he is the resistance, or let's say the original resistance in Iraq, the Mahdi army that fought the Americans, etc. Many of the Fasa'il or the pro-Iran resistance factions were splinter-offs from the Mahdi army. And so naturally, over the past 15 years or so, a little bit more, we've seen a development where these groups have fragmented. And because we have so many different leaders of paramilitary groups that claim their own sort of territory and turf, the scene has become more complicated. And certainly in the disputed territories that was mentioned, because the war against ISIS enabled these groups that have not really had an operational reach in the central and north of Iraq before to actually entrench themselves in these areas. So Iran, in this way, has been able to expand their network in Iraq vastly. I mean, you mentioned Anbar, so the central Sunni areas, and then the disputed areas they're quite mixed. They've co-opted many of the minority groups that actually carry out some of these attacks on behalf of them, both targeting the Kurdistan region, or let's say Kurdish assets and the disputed territories, but also occasionally fighting each other. And this is, I think, a dynamic that we need to keep an eye on too. Definitely, as long as Iran is under threat, I mean, perception-wise or otherwise, by other regional actors, they will coalesce around Iran, but they will also try to fight out, their internal competition with each other occasionally. We've seen that happening in a few governorates in the south, Misan in particular, where the Sadrist and Asa'ib al-Haq, for instance, have been at each other's throats. There's been a string of assassinations between them. This is not to say that this will necessarily expand and consume Iraq. I think that the conflict lines that Maria mentioned will be much more salient in Iraq, but it will definitely cause issues for a wide spectrum of the population, including Kurds and Sunnis and all other minority groups that live in the disputed areas. And to come to the point of Iran and how they view the government formation now. So I think that there was largely an understanding that Iran had sort of withdrawn a little bit or was not able to fill out the shoes of or the vacuum that Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis left. And I think that is true to a certain degree, that Qaani has not been able to fill that role. But very quickly, we could also see that Iran mobilized a spectrum of other actors. I mean, personalities that have good connections with Iraq that together are able to kind of manage those very complicated intra-Shia and intra-Hashid or Fasa'il relations. So at the end of the day, when it came to a point where this, let's say, this new experiment on the initiative of Sadr and the tripartite alliance with the KDP and the Sunni alliance, they saw serious alarm bells, and not just for the prospects of what government formation could look like in the future in Iraq, but I think also a genuine concern in terms of to what degree other regional powers were a part of that, and meaning the UAE, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia to a certain extent. So, from their point of view, what happens in Iraq is much more than an Iraqi internal affair. It has to do with how different Iraqi political actors or elites relate to other regional countries. So I think that for Iran, in a way, they're doing what they have always been doing, or essentially since 2003, which is to mainly manage Iraq through their Shia network, but also not to forget that Iran has quite good connections, both within the Sunni component and within the Kurdish component. I think that some of those relations have started to wane, in a sense that both of them, Sunni and Kurdish politicians have been under great pressure, but those are still levers that Iran can use quite successfully. And as long as we have a Shia-dominated government in Iraq, and that will be for the foreseeable future, I think that definitely Iraq will be a scene for these kind of conflicts to play out in. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lahib. Thank you very much for your observation. Extremely interesting also the relation within the different actors, let's say, that are battling each other for influence in the country, and how such a competition has significant spillovers well over the Iraqi boundaries. Dr. Al-Din Glower, how Ankara and Gulf states look at the current political impasse, and what role they could play, and how would they consider a coordination framework-led new government? Please, the floor is yours. Thank you. Sorry, Dr. Al-Din, you have to switch the microphone on. Perfect. Thank you.
Sorry. When we say Gulf countries, we're talking mainly Arabs that are led by Saudi Arabia, and they both had very clearly were watchfully, and they had a say, or they had tried to influence some of the dynamics, because they hoped that Sadr would succeed in his efforts of forming a majority government, because they thought this is ideal. If there is anyone who could peel Iraq away from Iran, it will be Sadr and the tripartite. But as time went by, they realized that it reached a deadlock that became an impasse, impossible. And that's when they started advising their own friends to take it easy and build bridges with the CF and with Iran. And they themselves were engaging Iran in different ways. So they tried to keep a distance, an equal distance between the two sides, but nonetheless hoping that the status quo, the deadlock that led to Kadhimi staying on, can continue until there's a breakthrough with Sadr still involved. But this was not to be. So now the Arabs, the best they hope is that they can engage the CF government. They would want the next government still be investing in the very things that Qatar invested in, establishing good relations with Egypt, Jordan, as well as the Gulf state, and being really acting more like a member of the pan-Arab world. They would not trust, obviously, somebody who's a hardline, hawkish prime minister who's actually appointed by, say, Maliki or a very strong pro-Iranian group. But it looks as though that the next prime minister would be somebody, a moderate, would be acceptable to everybody. So that's really how they look at it. They are concerned about Iraq's destabilization and the way it's drifting, but they're watching events without being seen interfering too much. I wanted to leave you time
Sorry, no, there was a
Q&A,
problem with the connection.
not expanding further.
Thank you very much, Dlaber.
Yeah.
Let's now move to the last part of our panel, and that has more to do with the several questions related also to the security in Iraq. And let's start once again with Maria, and let's start exactly from this point. Which are the main challenges Iraq has to face at the security level, and what contribution NATO mission in Iraq that is now under Italian leadership can offer on this side?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea. There are like the traditional security challenges. Unfortunately, I say traditional because they are like ongoing for several years, and I think that potential resurgence and regrouping of ISIS, especially in the disputed territory, especially in presence of this simmering tensions between paramilitary groups closer to Iran and Kurdish leadership, Kurdish forces on the ground. I think that this has been a sort of continuous source of concern, because already there has been always this difficult cooperation, security cooperation between the Kurdish side and forces that are part of the Hashd al-Sha'bi, and more importantly also even the Fasail. And I think that the problem is that whenever there is actually lack of communication between the two sides and coordination, then you create opportunity always for the resurgence of this and the reorganization of this cell. Or sometimes one of the actors actually use the knowledge that they have, that the fact that this extremist cell exists, to then unleash security crisis and security situations in some way that or it enables the resurgence of such cells and the reorganization of such cells. So this is something that has been a recurrent problem. But I think that, as I was mentioning before, there are like these new challenges. I think that we can really consider that in case of a return of an escalation between Iran and Washington, and Iran and Israel, we could really foresee a return to potential attacks on both US military bases and also on coalition bases across the country, but most importantly, I think in the Kurdistan region, and generally US assets in the Kurdistan region. So we have to be ready also for this type of scenario, and I think that if this scenario returns, Washington will be really, or at least this administration in Washington will be really facing a dilemma, because we know that Biden doesn't want to re-engage in the Middle East, and is not willing actually to respond directly to this type of provocations or attacks or retaliations, because they have other things to focus on at the moment. Therefore, it will be really a question mark on what they will do. Will they strike back, for example, in Syria, in northeastern Syria, as we have seen in the past, in case there is an attack on their assets? Well, I think that they themselves at this point do not have the answer to this, and because to this point, we cannot calculate how much further this escalation between Iran, the US, and Israel also will reach. If we reach really an escalatory point that is very high. So I think that still there are discussions ongoing on what are the possible scenarios. As for the question related to NATO, I do think, and I always said that an expanded mission of NATO, I mean, the formula for success of NATO in Iraq is really that one of having a clear European leadership within the mission in some way. Having a European country that is leading the command is already a very good sign and non-threatening sign, because it reduces the level of polarization between, especially in case of a return of an escalation between Washington and Tehran. So therefore, the formula for success is definitely giving also good willing sign of communication, I think, with both sides. I mean, being very also open to discuss as much as possible with political representatives that are also close to the Iranians. This has always been one of the key to actually deconflict and deflate tensions. And I do think that, especially in this moment where NATO is also at stake, it has like important duties elsewhere. I think that we really risk also the fact that, it's very important that within the scene of the Middle East, we don't create other crises in some way. So it's very important that, especially in a moment where there is such a polarization between NATO and the West in the eastern flank of the alliances, that in the southern flank of the alliances, things keep calm and balanced, and that we don't face a scenario of Iran shifting even more closer to the Russians and having, creating one pole against the West and reflecting these tensions also in the Middle East. So I think the role of the Italian command should be really that one of trying to, as much as possible, create and communicate communicate that they are there for training and not for a combat mission. This has been always the main message, and I think it should be repeated to everyone as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for your observation. Laib, you mentioned before the fact that in Maisan, if I'm not wrong, we witnessed the emergence of a growing competition, even struggles between intra-Shiite, let's say, groups and or militias, let's say so. What about are we witnessing a growing rift also within that groups of the PMF closer to Tehran? Because you mentioned very well before the fact that several groups that are now closer to Tehran were de facto emerged from within the Sadrist movements or the Mahdi army at that time. They were called the special groups at that time, at the very beginning. But now it seems we are witnessing a confrontation between some of the groups that were considered more closer to Tehran. Is that right?
Yes. Well, I think that this is it's a complicated conglomerate of groups that do have slightly different backgrounds as well. So if we look at one of the primary groups within the Hashid, which is the Badr organization. The Badr organization operated from Iran as an opposition, as an armed opposition, already in the 80s. And so naturally, there are close ties with Iran. But at the same time, the Badr organization, being one of the prominent groups, has also made inroads into the Iraqi state security structure in a way that most of the others haven't, in the sense that Badr has for a long time dominated parts of the Ministry of Interior, for instance. This means that I think at least that the Badr organization, for instance, would be more restrained when it comes to going into certain conflicts because they have a bigger stake in the state that they benefit from. But this actually goes for most of these groups now. So with the establishment of the Hashd al-Sha'bi institution, it essentially runs like a ministry, and it runs like a ministry that is extremely intransparent. We don't really know how the division of the funds are distributed. We know that there are many ghost soldiers, as we have this issue of corruption across all Iraqi security institutions, but the Hashd al-Sha'bi poses a specific challenge when it comes to this. On the one hand, they are a security institution that falls under the direct command of the prime minister, the commander-in-chief, but we also know that through the Hashd al-Sha'bi institution, they are able to siphon off quite a significant amount of money to armed groups that are not enrolled within the Hashd. And so this means that many of these groups, including Kata'ib Hezbollah, including Asa'ib al-Haq, and many of the smaller ones that are quite extremely lenient, let's say, to Iran, they're able to sustain themselves through the state. And so I think at this point, we have very few actors in Iraq that actually would want to see an unraveling of the status quo because they are a part of it. But they will also protect it only to serve their own interests, right? So if we would find ourselves in a scenario, for instance, of the most bleak ones that Maria mentioned, we could see increasing competition or conflict inside Iraq. But within the Shia community, or within the Shia political community, let's say, there is also a great taboo about internal strife. And so I think for the longest possible, they will try to put a lid on those tensions. There's another component to this that we should remember, and that is the people, the average Iraqi. And we know that the frustrations within the Shia community is potentially bigger even than it is in the Sunni areas or the Kurdish areas. And I think this is a component that will play out going forward. Even though the Tishreen movement has been crushed, there is still a significant demographic that is tilted towards the young population, and their grievances will remain. And on top of every other catastrophe that Iraqi will have coming its way, whether it is climate change, lack of electricity or potable water, et cetera, this will hit the South more than it hits anywhere else, at least to start with. And so for these groups, essentially being warlords rather than good governing actors, I think that they will face increasing internal pressure. But I think for as long as the oil prices remain as high as they are now, and if I understand the predictions right, this peak, even though it might not be at this high levels, will still continue to be quite high for at least the coming 2 years. And I assume this also is connected to how the evolution of the Russia-Ukraine war evolves. But for that period of time, and we know that most actors, political actors in Iraq, are very much interested in being able to maintain their patronage networks and expand them. And so while you can benefit from the state coffers, I don't think that anyone will significantly turn against the other or against the state in a way that it would collapse that system. But when that money runs off for whatever reason, or another external crisis hits the country, I think there is definitely potential for more conflict among these groups. But I think that they will play it out against others in the meantime, rather than among them.
Thank you very much, Laib, also for underlining the important economic dimension affecting the relation between the PMF and also other more established groups, let's say. Furthermore, we know very well how such realities play a significant role within the economic system in Iraq, especially in the disputed areas along the borders and in several sectors of the Iraqi economic system. Let's now end our panel with Glover, and once again, thank you once again for being here and for your contribution. We have a question from the audience, and I apologize, Laura, I did not send it to you before, but I think we can ask you to reply to it. It is a question from, let's say, the name is, just a second, Emiliano Alessandri, who was asking, his question is about Iraq multilateral engagement and its role in the region. What can Iraq do more to be fully recognized as an agent of regional dialogue, and which platform can help him to master his position and to become a stronger player in such a complex region? Because we, till now, we just mentioned the fact that Iraq has been deeply influenced by regional and international dynamics, yet Iraq is starting, not only in the last 2 years, but well before, to play an increasingly important regional role, international role. Please, Laura, the floor is yours, and I apologize once again for not introducing before and anticipating.
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. Basically, Iraq, as a state, needs to regain its sovereignty, and its leaders need to build the institutions of democracy and make sure that they have a more functional government, as well as a more functional state as a whole. Inherent strength in Iraq and the leaders' ability to design their own policies and unite behind joint manifestos will make sure at the end that everyone in the region, as well as the world, respect their view. And Iraq, being so strategically placed, geographically, politically, economically, Iraq can play a major role. It traditionally has done since its creation. So Iraq, given that you can see why it is such a center of events, it's because of its importance in every way. That is security, politics, economy, and contribution to a lot more. But the weakness, the inherent weakness, or the increasing fragility that Iraq suffered, and the leaders' lack of focus on regaining that sovereignty, has made them prey to regional interventions and so on. So neither internally Iraq is led well, nor the region has been really the regional powers investing in stability, and the disengagement of the international community have also not helped. The roles that you saw in the last few years that Iraqi politicians played in the region, and this was much appreciated actually by the Arabs, by the West, by lots of people, but this was actually micro attempts and sometimes seen as distractor from internal problems. When the government has crisis of finance, crisis of services, crisis of the economy and employment and security, as well as being squeezed in every side, this international engagement was seen to be one way of saying Iraq still exists. And it's true that Iraq still has that potential. It can still rise. It takes a lot of effort, both internally for Iraq to be led by better father figures, regional powers realizing that Iraq's instability and failure is actually going to harm them as well. It will destabilize them too. And the international community knowing that their disengagement allowed rivals in the region to interfere and create proxies, create alliances that fragmented the society, that militarized the society, that polarized everybody. So we've now reached a state where you cannot define what is an Iraqi policy or Iraqi strategy. You can always define which party's strategy, but you cannot define Iraqi strategy. And when you say Iraqi government, there is no such thing, because the Iraqi government is multi-component, each one looking in a different direction and unable, well, even the prime minister would not be able to conform or to bring them together. So the inherent weakness, the lack of institutionalization and state building, the lack of attention to translating the constitution to state building have all added to the addition to the other factors, the external factors that have undermined Iraq. I mean, imagine in the last 15 years, the Iraqi leaders, including the parliament, have failed to create major institutions that make Iraq build the state better, create better laws. There's the federal council that is missing. The court is no longer that independent. So essentially, the Iraqi leaders must focus on the internal problems, strengthening status their people. That is when people consider you as a partner and listen to what you say and follow through. Iraq's inability to deliver on any agreement with any country it has done has made it less of a partner. We need to reverse that. And it's down to the people who form government and decide that actually they are no longer guests, they are no longer in opposition. Iraq is theirs, and it's in their interest, in their collective interest, as well as their future sort of existence, that they should make Iraq work better, more functional with the rule of law. That's my immediate reaction to this question.
Thank you much, Dlawar. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Laib. Thank you for all the people who attended this meeting. It was a very, very interesting event. I do thank you very much. I hope we'll have the opportunity to meet again, and hope to see you soon. Thank you very much once again, and let's meet again in Italy or in Iraq.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.